Ronan Whitaker came home expecting silence. Not the comfortable silence of a resting house, the other kind. The silence that had lived inside his glass mansion like a second resident since the night everything ended. But tonight, when the car turned into the driveway, something was wrong. He heard music. And then, cutting through it like something he had no category for, he heard his sons laughing. His sick sons. His sons who had not laughed in over a year. Ronan sat frozen inside the car with his hand still on the door handle. The last time he heard that sound, Elowen was still alive. It had been a brutal 2 weeks. Ronan Whitaker stepped off his private jet at 9:47 in the evening, briefcase in one hand, the weight of a collapsed Zurich acquisition in the other. The deal had fallen through on the final day. $400 million of restructuring work, dissolved in a single afternoon because one partner lost nerve. He had not shown anger in the boardroom. He never did. He had simply closed his folder, thanked the room, walked out, and called his pilot. Control was the only religion Ronan Whitaker still practiced. The drive from the airfield to his estate should have taken 22 minutes. Tonight it felt like nothing. His mind was already somewhere else, already managing the next move, already calculating the pivot strategy before the loss had fully landed, where he pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. The house stood before him the way it always did at night. Vast, immaculate, lit from within like a structure that had never known disorder. People who saw it from the outside assumed it was full of life. It was not. For 14 months it had been full of machines, humidifiers, medical monitors. The soft, mechanical hum that had replaced laughter inside these walls since the night Elowen died and took the warmth of this house with her, when Ronan grabbed his briefcase. He expected what he always found. Silence. The kind that reminded him every single night that his wife was gone, that his sons were sick, and that all the money and strategy in the world had not been able to fix a single thing that mattered. He pushed through the front door, and he heard it. Music. Soft, unhurried worship music, drifting from somewhere deep inside the house. He stopped walking. Then, on cutting through the music like a sound he had forgotten the world still contained. Laughter. His son's laughter. Ronan's briefcase hit the marble floor. He did not bend to pick it up. He moved through the foyer, through the corridor, following the sound the way a man in a desert follows the sight of water. Not entirely sure it is real, afraid to believe it, unable to stop moving toward it. Callum, Brecken, Sayer, those 3 boys had not laughed since the week before their mother's funeral. He had watched them grow quieter month by month, smaller somehow, as though grief were a physical weight pressing them toward the earth. The nation's finest pediatric specialists had given it a clinical name: trauma-induced autoimmune response, persistent fevers, fragile immunity, endless hospital rotations. Ronan had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to fix what was broken inside them. Nothing had worked. Now he was standing outside the nursery door, heart pounding in a way it had not pounded since the night he stood outside an ICU room and bargained with a God he was not sure was listening. He pushed the door open, and everything inside him stopped. His 3 sons were standing, not lying in cribs behind the soft glow of monitors, not pale and still beneath weighted blankets, standing, wobbling, clapping, spinning in the clumsy or uncoordinated way of boys who have just remembered what their bodies are for. Callum was bouncing in place, knees bending unevenly, grinning like the world had just been invented. Brecken was clapping both hands above his head, slightly off rhythm, completely unbothered. Sayer spun once, lost his balance, hit the carpet, and laughed so hard at himself that the sound filled the room like something that belonged in a church. There were no oxygen masks, no humidifiers humming, on no pale faces searching the doorway for a father who never knew what to say when he got there. On the floor, in a simple blue uniform with a white apron, was Seraphina Vale. She was on her knees, clapping gently, swaying, encouraging them with a smile that had no performance in it, no professional distance, no clinical boundary. She was just present. Fully, quietly, completely present in a way that Ronan realized no one inside this house had been in over a year. A small Bluetooth speaker on the dresser played soft worship music. Something about rivers, something about healing, something about a god who does not abandon. Ronan stood in the doorway, briefcase handle still warm in his grip, and felt something move inside his chest that he did not have a name for. His sons looked alive, not managed, not medicated, not monitored. Alive. And it had nothing to do with him. He did not move. He could not. The anger from Zurich, the $400 million, the collapsed deal, the board's quiet doubts, all of it simply ceased to exist. What replaced it was something far more complicated. Relief so sharp it felt like injury. Shame so quiet it felt like truth. Gratitude so raw it had no direction, nowhere to land, no one he knew how to give it to. Then Serafina looked up. Her eyes met his. The clapping slowed. The laughter softened. The boys turned. Alsair saw him first and said, "Daddy," in a voice so ordinary and unguarded that Ronan's throat closed completely. Serafina rose carefully, smoothing her uniform. The confidence on her face did not disappear, but something in it shifted. A quiet recalibration, the way a person adjusts when they realize the room has changed. She opened her mouth. Ronan raised one hand. Not harshly. Just wait. He looked at his sons for a long moment. He looked at Callum, who was watching him with wide eyes. At Brecken, who had stopped clapping but still swayed faintly as though the music was still inside him. At Sayer, who had gotten back to his feet and was now leaning against Serafina's leg in the uncalculated way children lean against things they trust. Ronan nodded once. Then he turned and walked away before the thing building behind his eyes had a chance to arrive. He did not understand what had just happened. How he did not know what kind of man admits he is undone by the sound of his own children laughing. But he knew this. In 14 months of the finest medical care money could arrange, his sons had not looked the way they looked tonight. And she had done it. A woman he had never spoken to. A woman he had barely registered when the hire was confirmed. A woman with no medical degree and a handwritten note at the bottom of her application that his assistant had flagged as unusual. And he had not read it at the time. He read it now, standing in his study, suit jacket still on, the house still humming faintly with music from the floor above. Faith can go where medicine cannot. Ronan set the paper down, stared at the wall, and for the first time in 14 months he did not reach for his phone. Hello! Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's continue. Ronan Whitaker called Dr. Art Ansel Pruitt at 6:14 in the morning. Not because it was an appropriate hour, because it was the first moment he trusted himself to speak without his voice betraying something he could not name. Pruitt was the head of pediatric immunology at Stanford. He had been monitoring the triplets remotely for 7 months. He received Ronan's calls the way most people receive weather reports, with professional calm and careful language. This morning, Ronan did not want careful language. "Ari, pull the last 4 weeks of their blood work," he said. "Compare it against the previous quarter and call me back within the hour." Pruitt called back in 40 minutes. The report was not what Ronan expected. Inflammation markers were down across all 3 boys. Immune response indicators, which had been erratic for months, were stabilizing. Callum's persistent low-grade fever had not returned in 11 days. Brecken's lymphocyte count, which had alarmed 2 specialists in October, Sire had normalized without any change to his medication protocol. "We haven't adjusted anything," Pruitt said. "No new treatment, no new medication. Whatever is happening environmentally, Mr. Whitaker, it appears to be having a measurable physiological effect." Ronan sat with that word. Environmentally. He thanked Pruitt, ended the call, and went looking for Serafina. He found her in the nursery, while folding small clothing with the focused quietness of someone who understood that the work itself was a form of care. The boys were still asleep. The room smelled faintly of something warm. Eucalyptus, maybe, or the remnant of last night's music still settling into the walls. "What exactly are you doing?" Ronan asked. He had not planned the phrasing. It came out more direct than he intended, which was the only way he knew how to ask questions that mattered. Serafina did not flinch, or she set down the folded shirt in her hands, turned to face him fully, and answered without hesitation. loving them out loud. He waited for more. She did not offer any. Ronan had spent his entire career in rooms with people who believed confidence was a performance. He knew how to recognize someone holding a position. Serafina was not holding anything. She was simply stating a fact the way a person states the color of the sky, without needing the listener to agree. Nay, it unsettled him more than any clinical explanation could have. He left the room without responding. He told himself it was because he had a 7:30 call with his legal team. He knew that was not entirely true. 3 nights later, something woke him at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not an alarm, not his phone, a sound or the absence of one. The house had shifted in some way he could not quantify, and his body registered it before his mind caught up. When he walked the corridor toward the nursery, out of a habit he had developed in the early months after Eloan died. Checking, always checking, the way a man does when he has already lost something irreplaceable and cannot stop anticipating the next loss. The nursery door was partially open. A single lamp burned low on the far side of the room, casting the kind of soft light that belongs in old paintings. The cribs were quiet. All 3 boys still and sleeping. And beside them, in the small wooden chair that had been Eloan's reading chair, sat Serafina. She was not performing anything. There was no audience to perform for. She did not know he was there. She held a worn Bible open across her knees, reading in a voice so low it was nearly breath. He had to stand completely still to hear it. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. She paused. Then she set the book gently on her lap, bowed her head, and began to pray over his sons by name. Not in general terms, not with the sanitized language of professional care. By name. Callum. Brecken. Sayer. She spoke over each of them as though she knew something about them that went deeper than their medical files. As though she could see, in the low lamplight, not just 3 sick toddlers, but 3 souls worth fighting for. Ronan stood in the doorway until he could not stand it anymore. Then he walked back to his room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and felt something shift inside him that he had no framework for and no interest in examining further. Not yet. The child neurologist arrived on a Wednesday. Dr. Imara Owusu, Nairobi-trained, Chicago-based. Ronan had been referred to her by 2 different specialists who described her in the same terms: unconventional, rigorous, and unusually accurate. She spent 2 hours with the boys, ran her assessments, reviewed 7 months of reports, sat with the data the way someone sits with a piece of music they are hearing for the first time, finding its logic. Then she sat across from Ronan in his study and told him something no one else had said in 14 months. Physiologically, they are stabilizing. Their bodies are no longer in the acute stress response that has been driving these immune episodes. She folded her hands. But I want to be precise with you about what I believe has been driving it. She paused. Children this age do not have the emotional architecture to process grief independently. They absorb it from their environment, from the adults around them, from the atmosphere of the spaces they inhabit. Another pause, shorter this time. Mr. Whitaker, your sons have been mirroring unresolved grief. Yours. The room went very quiet. The house is tense when you are present. You have not cried in front of them. You have not spoken their mother's name within their hearing. You have managed this loss with extraordinary control. She said the word without judgment. And they have been carrying the weight of everything you have refused to release. Ronan said nothing. Whoever has been with them recently has changed the emotional climate of this space. That shift is showing up in their blood work. She stood, gathering her folder. The medicine was never going to be enough, Mr. Whitaker, because the diagnosis was never entirely medical. She left him with the silence and the truth of it. He found Serafina in the kitchen that evening. He had not planned what he was going to say. Planning, he was learning, was not useful in conversations that required something more than strategy. You think prayer cures disease? He asked. It came out harder than he intended. It usually did, when he was frightened. She turned from the counter and looked at him directly. She had a way of meeting his eyes that most people on his staff did not attempt, and he had not yet decided how he felt about it. No, sir, she said quietly. But I believe fear weakens rooms, and love strengthens them. He held her gaze. Children breathe what adults refuse to release. That sentence landed somewhere below argument. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, and he did not trust himself to speak again that evening. And he did not fire her, and he did not sleep well. And the following morning, all three boys woke up without fever for the 13th consecutive day. He began standing outside the nursery door at night. Not every night, but enough nights that he stopped pretending it was accidental. He stood in the dark corridor and listened to the soft worship music drifting through the gap in the door. And he listened to Serafina's voice reading over his sons. And he listened to the small sounds of three children sleeping without distress for the first time in over a year. The fevers did not return. The laughter remained. And Ronan Whitaker, who had built his entire life on the principle that every problem yields to sufficient force and sufficient intelligence, stood in the hallway of his own house one night with his arms at his sides and his throat tight and his certainty quietly dissolving around him. He looked up at the ceiling, and for the first time in 14 months, he spoke to God. Not eloquently, not with faith, just with the raw, reluctant honesty of a man who has run out of every other option. "If you're real," he whispered into the dark, "prove it." It happened on a Thursday, not during a storm, not during some cinematic moment that announced itself with atmosphere and warning. It happened on an ordinary Thursday evening while Ronan was in his study reviewing Q4 projections, and the house smelled like the soup Serafina had made for dinner, and Callum and Sayer had already been put down for the night. The monitor alarm was the kind of sound that does not require interpretation. It was the kind of sound that moves your body before your mind catches up. Ronan was down the corridor and through the nursery door in seconds, and what he found stopped everything inside him with a completeness he had never experienced in any boardroom crisis, any financial collapse, any moment his control had ever been tested before. Brecken was not moving. He lay in the crib, his small chest still, his color wrong in a way that Ronan's body understood before his mind was willing to form the words. The monitor screamed its single relentless note. Callum stirred in the adjacent crib and began to cry. Sayer sat up, wide-eyed and silent. Ronan reached into the crib. Brecken. Nothing. His hands, which had signed documents that moved industries, which had never trembled in 38 years of calculated living, were shaking. He grabbed his phone, called emergency services, gave the address in a voice he did not recognize as his own, gave Brecken's medical history in the clipped, precise language of a man who has rehearsed crisis management his entire life and has just discovered that none of it applies here. He hung up and looked at his son and felt, for the first time, completely and utterly helpless. Not the managed helplessness of a negotiation gone sideways. Not the temporary helplessness of a problem awaiting a solution. The real kind. The kind with no next move. He did not hear Serafina come in. He only became aware of her when she was already beside him. And she was not panicking. And that fact alone cut through the noise in his head like something deliberate. She looked at Brecken for one moment. Then she did something Ronan had not expected. She knelt. Right there on the nursery floor, between the crib and Ronan's shaking legs, she went to her knees and she reached up and she took his trembling hand in both of hers. He did not pull away. She bowed her head, and when she spoke, it was not the soft, nighttime voice he had listened to from the corridor. It was something different. Something that came from a place below composure, drawn up from a depth he had not seen in her before. Authoritative, desperate. Certain in the way that only people who have prayed through real darkness can sound certain. God, she said, and the word filled the room, you did not bring these boys this far to lose them now. Silence. The monitor continued its alarm. Callum was crying. Sayer had not moved. Ronan stared at his son's still face and felt the prayer land somewhere inside him, like a stone dropped into water, sending out rings he could not stop. Then Brecken gasped. It was not a gentle sound. It was the sound of something returning from a very long distance, sudden and desperate and unmistakably alive. His small chest heaved. His face shifted. And then he cried. Loud and furious and real. The cry of a child who does not yet have words for what just happened, but has feelings large enough to fill the room with them. Ronan's legs stopped working. He gripped the side of the crib with one hand, and Serafina's hand with the other, and he stood there while his son cried, and the monitor alarm gave way to the new sound of Brecken breathing, just breathing. And the paramedics arrived 4 minutes later to a child who was pink and screaming and alive. The doctors at the hospital called it a neurological episode. They used careful, measured language about misfiring signals and temporary respiratory suppression and the importance of continued monitoring. Ronan listened to all of it. He signed all the forms. He sat in the hospital chair beside Brecken's small bed for 6 hours while his son slept with a pulse oximeter on his finger and the steady green line of a working heart moving across the monitor screen. He sat there and he called it quietly, in the privacy of his own chest, by the name it deserved. Mercy. They came home the following afternoon. Serafina had prepared the nursery. Fresh sheets. The small speaker on the dresser playing its soft worship music. Callum and Sayer reached for their brother the moment the carrier was set down, touching his face with the gentle, investigating hands of toddlers who understood more than anyone had given them credit for. Ronan stood in the doorway and watched. And something in him, some last-held structure, gave way. He walked into the nursery. He lowered himself to the floor. Not onto a chair, not leaning against the wall. He went all the way down, knees on the carpet in the center of the room, and he put his face in his hands. He heard Serafina quietly usher the boys toward the far corner with a soft word and a toy, giving him the room without leaving it. When he finally spoke, his voice had nothing left in it to manage. I stopped believing the night she died. The words came out without architecture, without the framing he might have constructed if he had been in any condition to construct anything. I was angry. A breath. I am angry. I paid everything I had. I did everything right. I kept every obligation I knew how to keep, and she still... He stopped. Started again. I felt punished. I still feel punished. And I have spent 14 months pretending I don't, because there is no version of Ronan Whitaker who gets on his knees and admits that he is lost. The room held the words. Serafina did not rush to fill the space. She understood, in the way she seemed to understand most things, that some silences need to finish themselves. When she spoke, her voice was the quiet kind that carries. Grief is not proof of God's absence, she said. Sometimes it's evidence of how much love existed. He looked up. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, Sayer in her lap, watching him with eyes that held no pity and no discomfort and no agenda. Just steadiness. You didn't lose faith because you were weak, she said. You lost it because you loved her that much. God knows the difference. Ronan looked at his sons. Callum had abandoned the toy and crawled toward him and was now pressing his small palm flat against Ronan's knee with the solemn purposefulness of a child who has decided his father needs to be touched. Something broke open entirely. He wept. Not the controlled grief of a man managing an emotion. Not quietly, not briefly. He wept the way the body weeps when it has been holding something for 14 months, with no designated place to put it down. His sons did not run from the sound. Callum kept his hand on his father's knee. Brecken watched from the carrier with dark, serious eyes. Sayer leaned further into Serafina and watched too. They did not need it explained. They simply stayed. That night, for the first time since Elowin died, all three boys slept through without waking. In the days that followed, Ronan made 3 small changes that no one on his staff commented on because they were the kind of changes that speak without requiring acknowledgement. Then he removed the alcohol from his study. Not because anyone asked, because he had been using it the way he had been using 18-hour workdays and transatlantic flights. As a way of staying in motion so that stillness could not catch him. He retrieved the small wooden cross from the storage room, where it had lived since the week of Elowin's funeral. He placed it back in the hallway, in the exact spot where she had originally hung it, at a height she had chosen so the boys would be able to see it when they were old enough to stand. And in the evenings, when Serafina played worship music in the nursery, Ronan no longer stood outside the door. He came in. He did not sing. He did not pray out loud. He sat in Elowin's reading chair with Callum leaning against his arm and Brecken sprawled across his lap, and he stayed. Just stayed. The house no longer felt sterile. It felt alive. 4 months later, Dr. Pruitt sent a report that used a word he had not used in any of the previous 14 months of correspondence. Remarkable. All three boys were thriving, not stabilizing, not maintaining, thriving in the full, unqualified sense of the word, running the length of the upstairs corridor until the housekeeper called after them, arguing over toys with the passionate unreasonableness of healthy toddlers, eating with appetites that required Serafina to revise the weekly grocery list twice, and the immune markers that had baffled specialists across 3 countries had normalized completely. The fever cycles had stopped. The medical suite on the second floor, which had once hummed with equipment around the clock, had been quietly decommissioned. The cribs no longer had monitors attached to them. They were just cribs now. In a nursery that smelled like small children and wooden toys, and the faint warmth of whatever Serafina burned in the little ceramic diffuser she had placed on the windowsill in February. The story leaked to the press in March, the way things always leaked from the periphery of lives lived at Ronan's altitude. A journalist from a technology publication framed it as a profile on resilience, the Silicon Valley billionaire who had faced personal tragedy and emerged with his empire intact and his family restored. The article credited aggressive medical innovation and Ronan's commitment to cutting-edge pediatric research. He read it on a Tuesday morning over coffee. He set it down without comment. He knew where it had actually begun. Not in a Stanford laboratory, not in the medical suite upstairs. It had begun on a nursery floor, with a woman in a blue uniform clapping her hands beside 3 small cribs, refusing to let sorrow set the tone. Medicine had followed the healing. It had not let it. He called a meeting in April, not a board meeting, not a press announcement. A quiet gathering of 7 people, his estate manager, his chief of staff, his personal attorney, Dr. Owusu, Dr. Pruitt, the architect who had designed the original mansion, and Serafina. Serafina arrived last. She sat at the far end of the table in the same composed way she occupied every room, fully present, taking up exactly the space she needed, no more. Ronan stood and laid out the plan without preamble. The west wing of the estate, currently used for overflow guest accommodation and storage, would be converted. Fully. The renovation plans were already drawn. The funding was already allocated. Not from a corporate budget, not for tax purposes, not as a branding exercise. From Ronan personally, from the part of his wealth that had never been able to buy the one thing that had actually healed his house. It would be called the Eloan and Aveline Center. Eloan for his wife. Aveline for Serafina's grandmother, the woman who, Ronan had learned over 4 months of quiet conversation across nursery doorways and kitchen mornings, had taught Serafina everything she knew about faith as a lived practice rather than a performed one. The center would serve widowed parents and grieving children. Families living in the kind of silent trauma that does not show up on intake forms because no one has yet given them the language to name it. It would offer pediatric medicine alongside grief counseling, alongside spiritual care, built on the understanding that these things are not competing disciplines but parts of the same wholeness. He finished speaking and looked around the table. Then he looked at Serafina. I'd like you to run it, he said. Not as a member of the household staff. As executive director. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness but consideration. She looked at her hands, then back at him, and he could see her measuring something internal. Whether she was ready, whether she was enough, whether a woman with a small-town reference and no university degree belonged at the head of something this large. He had anticipated this. You healed my house, he said. Help me heal others. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the same simplicity with which she did everything that mattered. Yes, she said. I will. It was a Thursday evening in May when it happened. The light through the nursery windows had gone the soft gold of early evening, and the small Bluetooth speaker on the dresser was playing the same unhurried worship music that had become the sound of this house's recovery. And the boys had eaten. They had been bathed. They were in the gentle, loose-limbed state of toddlers who are not yet tired enough to sleep but too content to require much. Ronan was passing the nursery door when he heard them. He stopped. Not from dread. Not from the complicated anticipatory grief that had once made this doorway feel like a threshold between what he had and what he feared losing. He stopped simply because the sound arrested him. His sons were dancing, the same wobbling, exuberant, fully committed dancing they had been doing the night he came home from Zurich and stood frozen with his briefcase in his hand and felt his certainty crack open. But looser now, stronger. Brecken had developed a move that involved throwing both arms above his head and spinning until he staggered. Callum stomped both feet in an insistent, self-invented rhythm. Sayer swayed with his eyes half closed, holding a stuffed bear by one arm, entirely absorbed. Serafina was not in the room, or it was just them, just his sons, dancing in the evening light because they were alive and well, and because joy, once it returns to a house, does not wait for an invitation. Ronan stood in the doorway. Sayer opened his eyes. "Dad," Callum looked up. "Dad, dance!" Brecken stopped spinning and pointed with the solemn directness of a 2-year-old issuing a command that is not a request. "Dance, Daddy." Ronan stood in the doorway. He was aware, in some part of himself that kept record of such things, that this was exactly where he had stood 4 months ago, briefcase in hand, armor intact, watching his sons from the threshold of a room he had not known how to enter. He had no briefcase now. He had no armor left to speak of. He took one step forward, then another. He was not graceful about it. He had no rhythm that he had ever been aware of. And 4 months of emotional reconstruction had not apparently addressed that particular deficit. He moved into the music the way a man moves into cold water, committed once the decision is made, startled by the reality of it. Callum shrieked with delight. Ronan reached down and lifted Brecken, who grabbed 2 fistfuls of his father's collar and laughed directly into his face from a distance of 4 inches. He spun Callum with his free hand until Callum's feet left the floor, and the shrieking reached a pitch that probably concerned the housekeeper downstairs. Sayer abandoned the stuffed bear and wrapped himself around Ronan's leg and refused to let go, which made every subsequent movement a negotiation. Ronan laughed. Not the polite, boardroom-appropriate acknowledgement of something mildly amusing. Not the managed exhale of a man who has calculated that laughter is the appropriate response. He laughed the way his sons laughed, without architecture, without exit strategy, without any awareness of what it looked like from the outside. The cold billionaire dissolved entirely, and in the space where he had been, there was simply a father. Dancing badly and completely with his 3 living sons in the golden light of a Thursday evening, in a house that had learned, slowly and at great cost, how to be warm again. He understood something then that no acquisition report had ever taught him, and no specialist had ever been able to prescribe. Healing had not begun when the medicine worked. It had not begun with the Stanford blood work or the London specialist or the medical suite that had cost more than most people earned in a decade. It had begun on an ordinary evening when a woman with no credentials and no agenda and nothing to offer but her presence had knelt on a nursery floor and refused, simply, stubbornly, consistently refused, to let grief set the temperature of this house. It had begun when someone decided that love was louder than sorrow and acted accordingly, and kept acting accordingly until the walls themselves believed it. Sometimes God does not enter a house with thunder. Sometimes he does not arrive in the forms we have been trained to recognize. Not in the voice of the credentialed, not through the channels of the powerful, not announced by anything that would make the evening news. Sometimes he enters quietly, through a woman in a blue uniform, kneeling beside 3 small cribs, clapping her hands in the dark, speaking names over sleeping children, reading ancient words into the atmosphere of a house that had forgotten it was allowed to hope. Refusing, with every ordinary act of faithful love, to let sorrow have the final word.